Welcome to Cedar's Compass, where we explore the dynamic interplay between our inner landscape and our planet's ecology. Delve deep into the worlds of science, medicine, and philosophy as we discover the threads that weave us into the larger tapestry of life on Earth. Today we have a group of drugs that are targeting microbiota, right? We know we have antibiotics, we have antivirals, we have antifungals, we have anti-microbiotics, right? Anything that's going to be directly killing the microbiota. And we've built these antibiotics, these drugs to kill microorganisms, as a way to control what we call infections. And of course, they've had incredible fame and they've done amazing things and they've saved countless lives. Absolutely. And we've had a huge wave of microbiome hunters that came along and developed these drugs. You know, the first drugs that came from the mold that grew on the citrus peel, you know, the penicillin mold that then was developed to create these penicillin-based antibiotics. And so it went, and the idea was that, you know, we're going to kill the microbiota that are overpopulating. Whatever the infestation is, whatever the infection is, we're going to kill it, and then that'll bring, you know, the body back into balance. Well, I mean, this is an interesting facet because that's the microscopic aspect of this approach. You know, kill the thing that's overgrowing. At the level of the macroscope or the ecological perspective, what we see is that we have a similar approach, an antibiotic approach towards our ecosystem, towards elements in it. So we're gonna, you know, if there's something that's in our way, we'll kill it, we'll remove it. So I'm gonna start with the story of how we moved. I'm sure a lot of you heard this story. I mean, this is nothing new. I'm not making, you know, breaking new ground here, but hopefully I will at some point. So let's just go back to the idea that in a hunter-gatherer, indigenous type of community, human beings lived in direct contact with nature, and they lived in direct response with nature. It was a responsive relationship where nature applied pressures, humans responded. Very adaptive relationship. And it was directed by natural cycles, natural events. Things like the seasons, right? Things like the bug season, right? When suddenly, you know, a time of the year happened for people living by a river, oh, it got hot and there was rain and then the bugs came, they had to move, right? So everything was connected. We moved into new areas. We wanted to find food. We'd find new sources of food. Maybe we'd put together, you know, leaves and thatch, and we'd cut pieces of wood and do things we could with whatever tools we had, and we'd build structures so we could be out of the rain a little bit. But it was all made of the environment we lived in, and then it all melted in as we moved on. That was our relationship to nature, in cycle, one with it, part of it. And in that, what we saw was that there was an incredible amount of diversity in the natural ecosystem at the macroscopic level, the animals, the plants, the fungi. And then down at the microscopic level, also in our bodies, our microbiota populations were also extremely diverse because we're eating the dirt and the materials, the plants, the animals, everything was just coming into us, and we're super connected, like we're just in a fluid matrix of microbiota. So that was this original kind of life that people had. And in this story, I'm telling you that there was a change that happened. There was a shift in this relationship between the human being and its culture of nature to being something separate from nature, to observing nature from a different place. And we don't know what that was exactly. There's lots of ideas about it, lots of stories, but one of the obvious connections is that food was a resource that drove humans to move. And once humans could have food growing locally in one spot, they didn't have to move. They could stay in one place, grow the food, support with other resources in the local area, but grow that food and live there. And when they did that, they actually carved out more and more space in the local ecosystem, removed parts of it to make space for the thing they were growing. And then in the process of growing that thing, they would eat that thing. And now they could build a more concrete home, a place where they were set up and stable. But imagine the things that come with that, right? Suddenly you have replication, you have lots of reproduction, there's lots of abundant resources. Suddenly there's lots of people, lots of kids. There's, you kind of start to build structures, you protect yourself. You're protecting yourself from nature now. So the predators kind of go down. More of you together, you're safer. Now you have more people, and what happens is you kind of get more problems too, right? Like we get more waste. What do we do with the waste? What do we do with all that? Normally we're moving around and just dropping little bits, but suddenly it starts to pile up in one place. So a lot of problems start to evolve from this process, but also a lot of beautiful things, right? A new culture evolves around the agriculture. And eventually it goes into animal shepherding too, right? Animal husbandry. And so now we have this type of culture too, shepherding culture and farming culture. We have this whole, evolution of our mind into we have our own food established, and we create what we call civilization. And now, as we get into it, we start to see that, wow, we can really start to evolve, grow, establish more resources for ourselves until we can actually build structures. We can have places that are protected. Now we're really growing rapidly, we're reproducing. And now we start to see that as this happens, we have the beginning of like a village or a city or a town or something that's developed in a structure, right? That beginning is this beginning of this idea of civilization. And so civilization as separate from nature. Nature's out here, and I'm in civilization. I'm in the human world. And this is a mythological story that's been around for as long as we have history. The story of the fight between nature and civilization. There's a great old story that I really love and related to. It's the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was this great king who, represented civilization. He was greatly powerful among all humans. It's so strong. But there was also another figure, Enkidu, who represented nature. And he was also very strong, and he was like the power of all the animals, and they wrestled, and fought until they kind of saw that their strengths were very similar, but Gilgamesh was kind of going to win out at some point, and they had this kind of dynamic relationship where civilization was sort of able to establish itself as separate from nature and strong. So then the story goes that establishment started to grow further and further. People who are migratory and moving around at this time come along and they see, oh wow, look at this thing that's happening here. There's this, what is this? It's a culture. What's going on here? How did you do this? Oh, well, here, we have these seeds and we have this stuff. You can take it with you to where you live, and you can do this too. So people took that idea and took it out to other places. So they set up a new established home, a stable, non-moving, separate from nature civilization, right? So this starts to happen in points all over the place. Now we have this, and probably what we don't know for sure, but I would think that the way that things go in our history, evolutionarily, the kind of 100th monkey idea, that this idea might have popped up in multiple places simultaneously. Not that it was direct connection. Maybe so, I don't know. But for sure, the connection to that original, source, the start of this civilization spread out to different places from that initial spot. So that story to me is really important because it's beautiful. It has evolved us into a cultural phenomenon, right? A cultural creature. And from that, I think what we can gather is that we clearly removed ourselves from being one with nature and put ourselves into something separate, right? And there's a power in that. But what's happened over this next thousands of years, however long it's been, is that we've established this civilization so strongly that we've actually eliminated a huge part of nature. So much so that we have depleted one of the most important resources we have as a living being on planet Earth, and that is diversity. Diversity at every level, but diversity of microbiota. And that's what we're talking about here in our bodies. Literally, as we've depleted the diversity in our ecosystem, the diversity in our bodies has gone down. And there's some interesting statistics. If you look at data coming out today in the literature, you'll see that when you go to a place like the Amazon and you go and visit the Yanomami people down there and you get a stool sample from them, these people have not been civilized. They're still living the same life that they have always lived, moving in cycle with nature. They don't have contact with outside world except for researchers or little bits of people who have touched in with them, studied them a little bit. They have somewhere between 30 and 50% more microbiota diversity than an American person does. Further to that, if you take a place where people have very high population density, like let's say New York City, Manhattan, for example, the biodiversity goes down to another degree because you've now removed this connectedness with all the different types of microbiota, animals, and sharing, like I said, the dirt, the plants, the air, the liquid, the fluid, the other people, the things that you might touch to get their microbes and share them. It's all gone. You live in an apartment, you go down the stairs, the elevator, you get in the car, you go from the car, you go to the place you're going. Maybe it's a store, maybe it's a friend's place, but then you're back in the car, you're back to here. And so your connections to nature are very small and your connections to other people even are small. I'm sure there's exceptions to that. But the point being that it's the loss of biodiversity that has made us susceptible to a lot of the diseases that we have today. It's not the only factor, but I wanted to talk about this and this story because it's so important. And for me, as somebody who works with a lot of folks who suffer from cancer, this story is really important. Because as long as we're separate from the nature, from the ecological network in which we were born out of, in which we live, we're going to suffer. Because we have to have that biodiversity. We see what's happening in our ecological networks. They're breaking down. We can see this. We don't have as much nature to support us. And so the concept is, well, if cancer in our bodies is characterized by uncontrolled growth, how does that relate to the story I told you? Well, the story starts with uncontrolled growth. How did it happen? Well, because we took ourselves out of nature. We established our own food. We've got our own resources now. We're not sharing it, we're holding them to ourselves, and we're growing and growing and growing. Well, what happens? Well, we create a lot of waste, we suck up a lot of resources, we start to cut back diversity, we start to, cut away what's already there. And not with the intentionality that it might take to do it in a way that's sustainable or, co-evolve. So the connection I'm making is that for us, cancer in our bodies is a direct reflection of the way we have established civilized dominance of nature. And of course, you can take this story and say, well, what do we do about it? I mean, we're here, okay, we are here. Well, what we can do about it is that we can start to work to establish diversity around us. How do we do that? Well, of course, we can interact with other humans. We can interact with nature. We can get into the world. We cannot clean all the dirt off all the food that we eat out of our garden. There's so many microbes in the food that we get out of the dirt. They're in there and they're good for us. This is not, we go back to the origination of this story, right? We're hunting the microbiota. We got to kill them and get them. We're trying to live in this world where, we control them. Well, no. We need to work with them, build with them, live with them, and we need them for our survival. And so I think with the cancer story and the idea of cancering, I'd love to point you to go and take a look at my film, Cancer Culture, which addresses this whole idea about what is cancer, how does it manifest from both the outside the world and then inside our bodies, and how do you make that connection, and then so we can see it and establish it and understand that cancer is not just a disease, about a person in a body, but it's a disease about a culture. It's about a way of living. It's called cancer ring, right? It's this process of being uncontrolled growth, of being, a resource absorbing entity, one that destroys biodiversity and in its own doing. And I think this is interesting because we're so clever, right? We can clever ourselves into this place where we don't need nature anymore. Well, we've done that. And we're so clever that now we've got all these diseases, autoimmune diseases, and all kinds of chronic diseases and cancers, and all the things we've built, all these stories in our brains, the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, and we have multiple sclerosis, you name it. It just goes on and on. And most of these diseases are too much stuff. We've built up material in our bodies, just like we built it up in our world around us. So how do we get out of this? How do we change this? What do? We have to rewild. We have to actually re-diversify. How do we do that? We need to establish places in our world where we actually support nature becoming diverse again. We can't just keep destroying it. We can't live without it. That's the point. We have to live with it and within it. And so watch my film, please. I hope you get a lot out of it. I put a lot of my heart into it. I think it's really important, and it's a poetic expression of this story. And I think it's really important for us to consider that with our cleverness, with the cleverness of our minds, that we clevered ourselves into this, we can probably clever ourselves out of it too. And I encourage everybody who's watching this to think about, how could we clever ourselves out of this? What do we need to do? If diversity is the key, well, don't isolate yourself, first of all. Be with people, be with nature, and find ways to be able to do things. I see people, I just planted 1,000 trees. We planted 1,000,000 trees. I love that. That's beautiful. I watched David Attenborough. He's talking about rewilding. They took an island ecosystem and they just said, no more fishing here. And they did that just for a short period of time. They did it in Costa Rica. They said, okay, no more logging here. And in these places, you know what happened? The biodiversity grew so quickly that there was more teeming life coming out of these wild areas that it started to support and supply all these areas around it, much bigger areas than just themselves. So the story was, if we could just rewild a part of where we live, a part of this world, that we're gonna have a lot more health, we're gonna have a lot more diversity. And that diversity will be in us, in our bodies, in our microbiota, and it will be in the world that we live in. And I really believe that we can do this in a way that is holistic, that's supportive, and we can still maintain a really good quality of life. I think that's what all of us are really excited about with the way that we're doing it right now, is we really like the life that we're living, the quality of life that we're living. And I want to do that and maintain that while we create more biodiversity. What if we could make more biodiversity? We get even healthier. Is that possible? Let us know what your clever ideas are, and I can't wait to hear them. Thanks so much for listening.